I mentioned earlier that we have 3 former secretaries of Treasury, 2 former secretaries of State, and 2 former chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors. If anybody is measuring closely, they would notice that I am double counting. And the reason I am double counting is because there have been only 2 Americans since the dawn of the 20th century who have served as both Secretary of State and Secretary of Treasury. That would be Secretary George Shultz and Secretary James Baker. And by the way, as if that weren't enough, they each decided to outdo themselves even more. Shultz was also Secretary of Labor under Nixon, and Secretary Baker also in his spare time was Chief of Staff for 2 Republican administrations. You know, simply put, they just don't make them like this anymore. These are 2 living gods of public policy and political leadership, and it's been an honor to work with them. I'm sorry that George Shultz cannot be here today because he has been, along with another one of our co-authors, Tom Stevenson. The 2 of them are partners at the Hoover Institute, where they together lead the Shultz-Stevenson Energy Task Force. Well, George and Tom have been my partners in crime in this project since the beginning, and I am deeply grateful to both of them. Secretary Shultz has provided a written statement that will be in your packets, but that Secretary Baker has offered to read. And another one of our very key co-authors who cannot be here today, Secretary Hank Paulson, has also provided a written statement that Martin Feldstein will read during his remarks. With that, I'm deeply honored to introduce Secretary Baker, and I'm also deeply grateful because he has stood up to lead on this issue, and he has also been very helpful in the policy formulation as we moved this plan forward. So with that, let me introduce a living legend, Secretary James Baker.
Be careful. Be careful, Ted. Thank you. And thank you for what you've done to research and promote this proposal. Ladies and gentlemen, later on, as Ted indicated, I'm going to read to you a short statement from my colleague and friend George Shultz. As many of you probably know, George has always been able to work effectively at the intersection of politics and policy. When he reached out to me last year about this plan, I think he had recognized something with which I quickly agreed. And that is that for too long, we Republicans and conservatives haven't occupied a real place at the table during the debate about global climate change. Instead, we have tended to dispute the fact of climate change, and particularly the extent to which man is responsible for any changes in the Earth's climate. Now, I need, in the interest of full disclosure, to tell you that I was and remain somewhat of a skeptic about the extent to which man is responsible for climate change. But I do think that the risks associated with it, if the people who believe it has happened and is going to continue to happen are correct, the risks are too great to ignore, and that we need some sort of an insurance policy, and that if we can get an insurance policy that is a conservative approach based on the free market, that limits government, doesn't expand government, and that is competitive internationally, that's a win-win, and we ought to take a look at that. And that's why we're here today. We have no assurance at all that this is going to be something that the administration will grab hold of. We happen to believe that this would help make America great again, but that's our view. We'll see what the administration thinks about it. We don't need an insurance policy, though, that relies on government regulation as a stick with which to beat our power companies that power this country. And this proposal, as I think Ted has indicated, could lead to the elimination of most, if not all, of those very onerous EPA regulations having to do with the use of, with the production of carbon, the use of and the production of power in this country, including an outright repeal of the Clean Power Act. This proposal is essentially revenue neutral. When I did tax reform for Ronald Reagan back in 1986, it was a real slog. We're talking about tax reform today. I don't know whether we can get it done again or not. It was the only time it had been done in 100 years, and we would never have been successful if it hadn't been done on a revenue neutral basis. If you get it all wrapped around the axle of the budget debate, you're not going to get anything done. This is revenue neutral. Many of the companies which are responsible for the production of greenhouse gases, including 4 of the world's 6 largest oil companies, have now supported the idea in one way or another of a carbon tax. I don't want to see our proposal characterized as a carbon tax, even though that is included in it. This is a proposal for carbon dividends to the American people. And that's going to be, I think, the beauty of it in terms of trying to build public support for it. I was a big supporter, and still am, of our new Secretary of State, who is sitting in the chair I used to sit in on the 7th floor of the State Department, Rex Tillerson. He ran one of the world's largest corporations, and perhaps the biggest, as far as I know, oil and gas company in the world. And he has demonstrated his managerial abilities and his negotiating abilities, and I think he's going to be a terrific Secretary of State. But here's what he said some time ago. He said, replacing the hodgepodge of current, largely ineffective regulations with a revenue-neutral carbon tax would ensure a uniform and predictable cost of carbon across the economy. It would allow market forces to drive solutions. It would maximize transparency. It would reduce administrative complexity. It would promote global participation and easily adjust to future developments in our understanding of climate science, as well as the policy consequences of these actions. Supporting such an approach is not only responsible public policy, I happen to think it is also good politics. As Ted has said, polling indicates today that some 64 to 66% of all Americans worry to some degree or another about climate change. And demand for a response to this is growing in this country and around the world. So whether you really believe it as a fact, as Ted does, or think it can be debated, as I do, I think you need to take a look at the consequences of it if Ted is right, because they would be dire. And therefore, we ought to have some sort of an insurance policy. I think this plan does put America first. It allows our party, our political party, to lead from the high ground on a challenge that is critical and that faces all of us, in my view. Now, I want to read to you from a statement. I want to read a statement to you that my friend George Schultz sent us. I'm sorry I cannot be with you at the National Press Club today, but I am delighted to take part in this formal launch of the Climate Leadership Council and to be co-author, along with several of my longtime friends, of this important new report on carbon dividends. Carbon dividends. This is a program for carbon dividends. There's a carbon tax buried in there somewhere, but this is a program on carbon dividends. Make sure you understand that. And every American is going to get a dividend quarterly from the taxes that are collected on the production of carbon. George goes on to say, I like market solutions. Markets bring informed views on various sides of any transaction, and they generally produce optimal solutions. The carbon tax puts a price out there that levels the playing field among competing sources of energy, and then lets the market pick the winners. The revenue neutral aspect of our plan means that there will be no fiscal drag on our economy. In that sense, it is really not a tax, this is George, since no money stays with the government. Rebating the carbon tax proceeds through dividends means that the great majority of Americans will be economically better off under our plan than they are today under the onerous regulatory regime that we face. Massive amounts of physical evidence attest to the reality of climate change, says George, and the main cause seems to be increasing levels of carbon dioxide in the air. To the extent that anybody has doubts about the cause, they should consider the potential consequences, and they should follow President Reagan's approach to the depletion of the ozone layer. When George and I were serving President Reagan, he advocated for an insurance policy, much as we're advocating today an insurance policy against the depletion of the ozone layer. As it turned out, the scientists who were worried at that time about that depletion turned out to be right, and Reagan's Montreal Protocol came along just in time. So we argue that we ought to substitute a carbon tax for the raft of regulations and subsidies that now characterize this issue. For the sake of our children and grandchildren, I believe it is imperative that we set forth a climate solution that embodies long-standing conservative principles and can return the Republican leadership to a constructive stance on this critical issue. Thank you all very much.